They thought they could hide it. Behind every diplomatic handshake, every security agreement, every whispered promise of development aid, there was a wire, a satellite uplink, a contract signed in the shadows. I knew something was wrong, not because of what they said, but because of what they avoided. ECOWAS was never just a regional alliance. It became a net. And the spider spinning it? Langley. But now the web has been torn apart. Let me show you exactly how it began, what we found, and why this time it's over. It started with a document, a bland folder delivered by a mid-level defense clerk, stamped with the insignia of an infrastructure inspection request. Harmless, until I opened it. Page 2 mentions satellite positioning access granted to a third-party vendor. That name triggered something in my memory, a defunct company blacklisted by Guinea over espionage charges in 2018. Another footnote referenced technical advisement from a regional intelligence liaison based out of Niamey. That was the first red flag. The second came 3 days later, when our telecom minister reported routine disruptions in government network lines. Nothing huge, just noise, just glitches. But I've learned over the years that the smallest signals often reveal the largest systems, so we dug. Every ECOWAS nation hosts regional command nodes. Think of them as help centers that allow cross-border security coordination, customs alignment, trade facilitation. But ours had something extra, buried beneath the ECOWAS fiber line, a second channel, encrypted. It didn't route through Ghana, or Nigeria, or even France. It tunneled straight to a server array in Virginia, Langley to be exact, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't diplomacy, this was surveillance. A full-spectrum backdoor intelligence channel operated under the cover of West African Unity. You know the names they give themselves, consultants, liaisons, strategic advisors, but we traced the ECOWAS visitors who attended our last 5 national security briefings. 4 of them held dual citizenships with nations outside Africa. 2 of them were former defense analysts for AFRICOM, and 1, a man who used to operate under diplomatic cover in Libya before 2011, an expert in transition logistics. This wasn't accidental, this was coordinated. We gathered evidence, dozens of files, network maps, transcripts of intercepted communications, photos of classified briefings attended by unauthorized observers, and we waited. Until the ECOWAS Council convened in Accra, I walked in calmly. I wore no flag, only the truth. I laid the documents on the table. You called us brothers, I said. But some of you are feeding our secrets to your paymasters across the ocean. Gasps. Silence. One delegate left the room immediately, but it didn't matter, because we had what we needed. Burkina Faso would withdraw from ECOWAS. Not in fear, but in clarity. Within 48 hours, the noise began. Destabilization, security vacuum, terror corridors. Western media spun panic, while diplomats sent urgent messages demanding explanation. But I sent one reply. If you want access to West Africa, you will speak to us, not through hidden servers or stolen agreements. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about a pattern. From Libya to Mali, from Sudan to Niger. Every partnership came with strings. And when a nation pulled back, they sent drones, sanctions, or worse, division. But we're rewriting the script. No more puppet strings, no more hidden hands. The CIA's ECOWAS network has collapsed, and a new African unity is rising, this time rooted not in Western approval, but in African truth. I did not sleep that night. Burkina Faso had always faced threats, but this time it wasn't a war of guns. It was whispers in hallways, files that vanished, orders that got misinterpreted. Something was wrong inside the walls of West Africa itself. So I ordered silence. Absolute silence. We shut down our satellites, encrypted all internal communications. I even suspended cabinet meetings. My most trusted team operated from a cold concrete room under the Capitol, away from every digital signal. Then, we started pulling strings. Our first discovery came from a low-level clerk in Niger, a man who had worked with ECOWAS security liaisons. He was nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder. But when he spoke, he handed us the thread that would unravel everything. He told us about a series of harmless programs funded by USAID and ECOWAS grants. Programs that appeared to support agriculture, infrastructure, education, but behind the paperwork was something else entirely. Hundreds of blank budget lines, cash withdrawals, and local consultants with no last names. I asked him one question. Who were they reporting to? He said, "Not us, not Niger, not ECOWAS, not even the West African governments they claim to serve. All roads pointed back to Abuja, and then further west, straight into Langley. The Americans didn't make mistakes. Their network was buried deep, like roots underneath a crumbling house. But there was one thing they didn't anticipate: our memory. Burkina Faso remembers its pain. From colonization to coups, from Sankara to now, every betrayal is archived in our bones. And that meant we knew how to track the signs, the slow rot that always begins with foreign hands pulling our leaders like puppets. So we went hunting. We embedded agents across Ghana, Togo, Senegal, Ivory Coast. Not soldiers, farmers, mechanics, fishermen, the invisible citizens. Their job was simple: watch ECOWAS offices, map their movement patterns, listen to who visited late, track where the black cars parked, count the crates, photograph the deliveries, and within weeks, a pattern emerged. There were hubs, physical strongholds, all camouflaged as ECOWAS logistics depots or diplomatic coordination zones, but the crates never matched the manifests. The communication lines had no official endpoints. And worse, the biometric locks on the gates were American-made. I asked my analyst, "Are these logistics centers?" He said, "No. These are forward operating bases." My blood boiled. They weren't supporting ECOWAS. They were hijacking it, using it as a Trojan horse to establish a covert surveillance web across West Africa, hidden under humanitarian pretense, protected by ECOWAS jurisdiction, funded by CIA-linked NGOs, and every single document we found led to one department: Regional Stability Coordination at ECOWAS headquarters, a title that sounded innocent until we traced the initials RSC back to a series of defense contractors blacklisted in Afghanistan and Iraq for psychological warfare testing. Yes, psychological warfare, not just watching us, but shaping narratives, engineering divisions between local tribes, leaking false news about border skirmishes, creating artificial panic in markets, then swooping in with diplomatic solutions. They were manufacturing chaos so they could offer control. You see, when a snake hides in the grass, it doesn't fear your strength, it waits for your trust, and ECOWAS had earned that trust over decades. We believed it was our union, our defense. We believed it stood for West African solidarity, a shield against Western interference. But now that shield had become a weapon used against us, and someone inside, had handed them the keys. I needed to know who. We began phase 2 of the operation, code-named Noma, after the silent disease that disfigures the mouth and face of the poor. Because that's what this was, a rot, spreading silently, eating us from within. We dug deep. Bank accounts, travel records, unscheduled meetings, calls to foreign embassies that never appeared in diplomatic logs. And then came the breakthrough, a nameless Swiss account linked to an ECOWAS procurement director. Millions of dollars. Deposits every 3 weeks. Always after a diplomatic visit. At first we thought he was the center, but he was just a courier. He was funding others. Journalists, clerics, tribal leaders, even a popular social media activist who had been stirring fear over a growing Russian threat in Sahel, all of them paid to turn African eyes away from the real enemy. But one name cut deeper than the rest: Colonel T.S., a regional commander stationed in Ghana, respected across borders, known for peacekeeping missions and joint drills. I had met him. I had embraced him. He once told me, "President, your defiance gives the rest of us courage." And yet there he was, smiling in photos with U.S. defense attachés, attending classified security briefings hosted under agriculture conferences, approving facility construction grants with no parliamentary oversight. A staged announcement that Burkina Faso was initiating a total blackout audit on all ECOWAS-connected foreign funds. I wanted to see who would panic. And they did. Within 24 hours, we intercepted a secure call, routed through 5 nations, between Colonel T.S. and an unnamed American asset based in Senegal. He said just one sentence before encrypting the line: "He knows." I did. The next day I made a call of my own, to Colonel T.S. He didn't answer, so I recorded a voice message. Calm. Precise. "Brother, you stood with us in the storm. But the storm is now within us. You have 48 hours. Come clean, or I will come for the entire network, and history will decide your fate." He replied in 3 hours, "I'm not your enemy, Ibrahim." But he didn't deny it. And in war, silence is confession. The world didn't expect what came next. I called for an emergency ECOWAS summit in Lomé, Togo. Officially, it was to discuss escalating foreign influence in Sahel defense infrastructure. But everyone in that room knew this wasn't a discussion, it was a reckoning. 21 seats, flags from Senegal to Sierra Leone, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, and behind every handshake, suspicion. I walked in last, not as a politician, not as a speaker, but as a man delivering a verdict. I stood at the center, no teleprompter, no script. Just one file folder in my hand, black, unmarked, and very, very dangerous. "Gentlemen," I began, "today is not about Burkina Faso, it is about Africa's spine, and whether it still stands." No one interrupted. I opened the folder. Slide after slide. Bank transfers. CCTV footage from ECOWAS headquarters showing restricted rooms accessed after hours. Satellite imagery of construction sites labeled aid logistics but built to military spec. Wiretaps of ECOWAS advisors echoing word for word CIA memos sent 2 weeks earlier. And then I dropped the final piece. A full layout of the Sahel Stabilization Cell, a classified interagency unit run by the CIA out of Dakar, whose mission, in their own words, was to exert logistical, ideological, and economic influence on West African regional decision-making bodies through embedded liaisons, infrastructure grants, and psychological steering. And who were those regional decision-making bodies? ECOWAS. The room fell dead silent. I looked directly at the Nigerian delegation, then Ghana, then Senegal, and finally I said it. We have been sitting at a table run by the puppeteers of our colonizers, and some of you helped them pull the strings. One delegate stood. From Guinea-Bissau. He cleared his throat and said, "President Traoré, these are serious allegations. If you truly believe this, why not go public through proper international arbitration?" I smiled. "Because proper arbitration was written by the same hands that built this cage." I responded, "Because I will not seek permission from the jailer to dismantle the cell. I came to break it, not appeal to it." By that night, I had already made my move. While the summit was still unfolding, I issued Presidential Order 107F, declaring all ECOWAS operations inside Burkina Faso to be suspended, all grants frozen, and all foreign-affiliated personnel subject to vetting under Burkina Faso's national security mandate. That included 2 CIA-linked contractors stationed as IT consultants inside ECOWAS offices in Ouagadougou. They were detained within 45 minutes. One tried to flee, the other had a burner phone in his shoe sole. Neither would speak, but their laptops did. Inside those machines was something no one expected: direct command chain logs referencing Langley reviews, archived communications with AFRICOM discussing mineral rights influence strategies, simulation models predicting maximum social destabilization if Traoré allies were removed by soft coups. They didn't just infiltrate ECOWAS, they were using it to simulate regime collapses. But that wasn't the worst part. There was a subfolder titled Eco Shell. I opened it. Inside was a master list, names of African officials categorized under blue, gray, and red. Each had a corresponding code. Blue meant asset in use, gray meant in consideration, red meant uncooperative, neutralize influence. And there I was, red. Alongside my allies in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad, they weren't just observing us, they were planning for our replacement. The moment I read that, I made my final decision. ECOWAS could no longer be salvaged. It had become a shadow operation with a logo and anthem, a Trojan horse backed by the very empires we fought to escape. And if no one else would shut it down, I would. It was time to speak. Not just to the ECOWAS leaders behind closed doors, but to the world. We held the press conference in Ouagadougou, at the same square where, decades ago, Sankara had declared, "He who feeds you, controls you." That day, I stood before the same soil, but with a very different fire. There were over 60 cameras, journalists from Al Jazeera, RT, Anadolu, even CNN. Thousands of Burkinabe citizens packed the plaza, shoulder to shoulder. But I wasn't speaking to them alone. I was speaking to every African who's ever asked, why do we keep losing even after we win independence? And to every foreign hand still trying to write our story behind a desk in Washington, Paris, or Tel Aviv, I didn't read a speech. I spoke from memory, from scars, from the files I had burned into my mind. I began like this: today we expose not just an operation but an era. Then I laid it out. How the CIA embedded liaisons into ECOWAS under humanitarian covers. How infrastructure projects were used as bait to control logistical choke points. How EcoShell categorized African leaders like files in a cabinet. How psychological warfare tactics were tested in Niger protests. How certain West African presidents received payouts to vote a certain way. And I ended with the words, "This is not a theory. This is not a conspiracy. This is a confession, forced from the hard drive of empire." Silence followed. You could feel the air change. Some reporters didn't even take notes. They just stared, as if the wind had been knocked out of them. Then came the journalists' questions, rapid fire. Will you dissolve ECOWAS membership? Are there other countries involved? Is this a declaration of war against the West? I responded simply, we are not declaring war. We are ending one that has been declared on us, silently, digitally, economically, for decades. The response came fast. France issued an emergency statement calling the accusations dangerous misinformation designed to destabilize diplomatic progress. The CIA refused direct comment but quietly pulled back non-essential contractors from 5 Sahel region countries. Israel's Mossad-linked cybersecurity firm Nixtel, which had a dormant office in Ghana, suddenly went dark online. Their domain was wiped clean. Social channels vanished overnight. But none of it mattered, because the people saw the receipts. Within 48 hours, hashtags calling to dismantle ECOWAS were trending across African social platforms. The streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry filled with crowds waving Pan-African flags and chanting "Stop the Puppets." 3 presidents in West Africa were forced to issue statements distancing themselves from ECOWAS. The House of Cards was trembling, and then Mali and Niger announced what no one expected: a Sahel sovereignty bloc, independent from ECOWAS. Modeled around mutual defense, resource nationalism, digital sovereignty, and anti-colonial solidarity, we joined them. And just like that, the 3 nations the West tried hardest to destabilize were now building the very union they feared most, one not written in Western contracts, but in African blood, land, and fire. But the most shocking twist, it came from within ECOWAS. 2 weeks after the press conference, a senior advisor from ECOWAS's Lagos office, a woman named Aminata Diawara, contacted my office. She asked for asylum, not political, moral. She brought with her a USB. On it, more evidence. Minutes from secret meetings with NATO observers posing as logistics consultants. Biometric data contracts being tested under refugee welfare programs in northern Nigeria with Israeli data firms. Simulation software built by a joint CIA and MI6 task group titled Democratic Interference Threshold Models. I remember looking her in the eye and asking, "Why now?" She replied, "Because I realized the West doesn't want partners in Africa. They want passwords, and I was one." The final blow came not from me, but from the people. An ECOWAS summit was scheduled in Abuja. Tensions were high. No press was allowed. No live stream. Just the flags and the same old script. Until it wasn't. Outside, a crowd of over 50,000 surrounded the venue. Students, veterans, traders, elders, all chanting, "Not in our name." They held up homemade signs. No more puppets. Sankara was right. End the silent war. That night, Nigeria's vice president quietly left the summit before it concluded. The next morning, Ghana's president withdrew support for further ECOWAS sanctions on Sahel nations, and by Friday, the ECOWAS alliance, as we knew it, was dead. When I was a child, I watched my uncle sell cassava at the same market where my mother worked. One day, I asked him, "Why do the foreigners always carry clipboards but never buy anything?" He looked down and said, "Because they're not here to buy, my son. They're here to count." Decades later, I realized he was right. They weren't just counting crops. They were counting us, our weaknesses, our divisions, our silence. And for too long, we let them. But now, everything has changed. With the collapse of ECOWAS came opportunity, but opportunity without structure leads to chaos. So we acted fast. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, once treated like outcasts, drafted what we called the Kaya Accords, named after the historic city where revolutions are remembered in blood. The Kaya Accords included a joint military command stationed in Ouagadougou, resource control boards, ensuring all foreign deals pass public audits, digital sovereignty zones with no foreign surveillance firms allowed, and a shared satellite program named Sankara 1. Yes, a space program, because if they can spy on us from above, then we can watch the skies on our terms. The world laughed at first, but they're not laughing now. What we did wasn't just political, it was psychological warfare in reverse. The CIA spent billions trying to break our sense of self. We rebuilt it with 5 principles. Memory over myth, we don't forget our martyrs. Land over loans, we don't sell what feeds us. Truth over treaties, no signature can overwrite justice. Unity over borders, we draw lines only in dignity, not in dirt. Legacy over survival, because life without honor is just breathing. We knew the empire wouldn't let go quietly. Treasury imposed sanctions on 12 of our ministers. Israel quietly revoked cybersecurity licenses for our diaspora tech firms. They tried to isolate us. But something strange happened. We got stronger. Russia and Iran signed new energy deals with no military strings attached. Turkey offered agricultural drone tech on a barter basis, wheat for wings. Brazil and South Africa invited us to co-host a new Pan-South Media Alliance. The West's blacklist became our passport to real partnerships. Their punishment became our purification. And the people knew it. I want to speak now to you, not as president, not as soldier, but as a son of this soil and as your brother, you who were told your dreams were too loud, you who were taught to bow before Western knowledge, you who were sold a passport but lost your purpose. Let me tell you something. You are not late to the revolution. You are exactly on time. This moment is yours to finish, but not with violence, with vision. Don't burn it all down. Build something so African it terrifies them. Write code in Swahili, open schools in Wolof. Farm like your grandmother, trade like your grandfather, think like Sankara, lead like Lumumba. Die if you must, like a lion, not a leashed dog. Because when the CIA came for us through ECOWAS, we didn't just survive, we ended their grip. People always ask me, Captain Traoré, what do you want your legacy to be? I'll tell you the truth. Legacy is not what you leave, it's what you unlock. If I vanish tomorrow, in a plane crash, a coup, or a quiet assassination, know this. The virus has already spread. Africa has tasted sovereignty, and she will never be hungry again. This is not just a story about intelligence agencies, treaties, or networks. This is about a continent that remembered it had a spine. It's about 3 nations who stood against an empire's shadow. It's about mothers who refused to eat from poisoned aid. It's about soldiers who said no to UN chains. It's about you, the viewer, realizing that every system that controls your mind started in silence and ends when you speak. But the story doesn't end there. Because what came after the collapse was something even more profound. It was the reconstruction of an idea that had been dormant for generations. The idea that Africa doesn't need permission to be sovereign, that our resources belong to our children, not to boardrooms in Manhattan, that our intelligence shouldn't be harvested by algorithms designed in Silicon Valley, that our future is not a commodity to be traded on markets we never agreed to enter. And most importantly, that resistance isn't just about saying no, it's about building the alternative so strong, so rooted, so undeniable that the old systems become irrelevant. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened across the Sahel. Villages that had been divided by artificial borders began to trade freely again. Farmers who had been told their methods were primitive started teaching agricultural techniques that required no Western patents, no chemical dependence, no debt cycles. Young programmers in Ouagadougou and Bamako launched open-source platforms in local languages, creating digital ecosystems that didn't extract data, didn't surveil users, didn't feed information back to servers in Virginia or Tel Aviv. This was the real revolution. Not the dramatic press conferences or the document dumps, but the quiet, methodical rebuilding of systems designed by Africans. For Africans, we established what we called knowledge sovereignty zones in each of the 3 nations. These were not just schools or universities in the traditional sense. They were laboratories for rediscovering what had been stolen, suppressed, or forgotten. Teams of historians, linguists, and elders worked together to compile oral histories that had never been written down, not because they weren't valuable, but because the colonizers had deemed only their written records as legitimate. Engineers studied ancient irrigation systems that had sustained civilizations for centuries without petroleum-based machinery. Healers documented plant-based medicines that pharmaceutical companies had tried to patent after extracting the active compounds and rebranding them as discoveries. The West called it regressive. They said we were romanticizing the past, rejecting modernity, choosing poverty over progress. But they misunderstood, as they always do. We weren't rejecting technology or advancement. We were rejecting the premise that progress must come through their gateway, on their terms, mortgaged against our future. We were building a different kind of modernity, one that didn't require us to forget who we were in order to become who we wanted to be. Of course, there were challenges. The sanctions hurt, not as much as they wanted them to, but they hurt. Supply chains that had been deliberately routed through Western-controlled ports now needed alternatives. We had to negotiate new trade relationships with nations that had their own complicated relationships with the West. China offered partnership, but we had learned from watching others fall into debt traps disguised as development loans. We negotiated carefully, transparently, with terms that were debated publicly rather than signed in secret. Russia provided military cooperation, but we made it clear that we weren't trading one master for another. Every agreement included sunset clauses, public audit mechanisms, technology transfer requirements. We were learning from everyone's mistakes, including our own. The hardest part wasn't the external pressure, it was the internal doubt. Decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight. There were ministers who questioned whether we could really survive without Western aid, business leaders who feared losing access to European markets, intellectuals who had been educated in Paris or London or Washington and couldn't imagine that knowledge produced outside those systems could be legitimate. I spent countless hours in meetings, not arguing with enemies, but convincing our own people that we weren't committing economic suicide. That sovereignty had a cost, yes, but so did subjugation. And that the bill for subjugation was always presented to our children in currencies they could never repay. I remember one particular meeting with a group of young economists who had been trained at elite Western institutions. They presented models, charts, projections showing how our isolation from ECOWAS and Western financial systems would lead to collapse within 2 years. They were sincere, not saboteurs. They genuinely believed what they were saying because that's what they had been taught. So I asked them a simple question. Who designed the models you're using? Where do the assumptions in your algorithms come from? Who decided what counts as growth and what counts as failure? They didn't have answers. Because they had never thought to ask. That was the nature of the trap. It wasn't just physical infrastructure or military presence, it was epistemological. They had colonized the very frameworks we used to think about ourselves. Success was defined as integration into their markets. Development was measured by how closely we resembled their economies. Progress meant adopting their technologies, their languages, their educational systems, their values, and anyone who questioned this framework was labeled backwards, tribal, anti-modern. But we were beginning to see through it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Sankara 1 satellite program became the symbol of this new consciousness. When we announced it, the mockery was immediate and global. African nations launching a satellite? Preposterous. They should focus on feeding their people, on basic infrastructure, on fighting terrorism. Why waste resources on space when there were problems on the ground? But we understood what they didn't want us to understand, that satellites aren't just about space, they're about information, about who sees what, when, and from what angle. About who controls the images that shape narratives. About who has the high ground, literally and figuratively. We couldn't afford to build it alone, not from scratch, but we didn't need to. We partnered with engineers from Iran, who had been building indigenous space technology under sanctions for decades. With programmers from Cuba who had developed sophisticated systems on hardware that would be obsolete anywhere else. With scientists from North Korea who, whatever else you might think of their government, had figured out how to launch satellites without permission from the powers that had tried to prevent it. These were the universities the West didn't want us to attend. These were the partnerships they called dangerous, but they were the only ones offered without conditions that would compromise our sovereignty. The day Sankara 1 achieved orbit, I watched the launch from a viewing station set up in a village outside Ouagadougou. Not from a high-tech command center, but from the same red earth where children played and women carried water. The crowd erupted when the confirmation came through. not because they understood the technical details, but because they understood the meaning. For the first time in our history, something African was looking down at the world instead of being looked down upon. Our own eyes in the sky, our own data, our own images, the beginning of our own story told in our own voice. But with every victory came new threats, and these were more subtle than sanctions or military pressure. They came in the form of co-optation. Suddenly, Western NGOs wanted to fund our sovereignty projects. International organizations offered to help us develop our alternative systems with just a few advisors, just a little oversight, just some minor adjustments to make them more viable in the global economy. They smiled and praised our initiative while simultaneously trying to absorb it back into the very structures we had escaped. We had to learn to say no to help, which is perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Because the help always came with hooks hidden in the fine print. There were assassination attempts, 2 that we know of, probably more that we disrupted before they developed, car bombs, poisoned meals, the usual tools of empire when its softer methods fail. I moved regularly, never sleeping in the same location 2 nights in a row. My security detail grew, but I insisted they be Burkinabe, people whose loyalties couldn't be purchased because they understood what was at stake, not just my life but the possibility of a different future. Every time they tried to kill me, my resolve hardened, because it confirmed what I already knew, that we were on the right path, that they feared what we were building, that our success was their nightmare. The breakthrough moment came when we successfully completed our first harvest under the new resource sovereignty framework. We had restructured our cotton industry, the crop that had been the chain binding us to French textile companies for generations. Instead of selling raw cotton at exploitative prices and buying back finished goods, we built processing facilities domestically. We trained our own textile workers. We designed our own fabrics incorporating traditional patterns that had been appropriated by European fashion houses for decades. And we sold directly to markets in Asia, Latin America, and other African nations, bypassing the middlemen who had extracted wealth from every transaction. The profit margins were astonishing, not because we were exploiting anyone, but simply because we were keeping the value we created. The farmers earned more, the workers earned more. The government collected more revenue, and we still sold at competitive prices because we had eliminated the parasitic layer that had been siphoning resources for generations. This wasn't complicated economics. It was simple arithmetic, but it had been impossible under the old system because the system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of vertical integration. ECOWAS rules, written with Western input, had made it easier to export raw materials than to process them domestically. Trade agreements had forbidden the kind of industrial policy that would allow us to build our own manufacturing base. We had been kept as a source of raw materials, not as producers of finished goods. But now, outside that system, we could rewrite the rules. Other nations watched, not just in Africa but across the global south. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could do this, small nations with limited resources, sanctioned and isolated, what could larger nations achieve? What could regions achieve? What could the entire global south achieve if they coordinated their resistance? The question hung in the air like the smell of rain before a storm, and the empire felt it. You could see it in their increasingly desperate responses. The propaganda became more shrill, the threats more explicit, but also more hollow, because they had already played their strongest cards. They had already done their worst. And we were still standing. I began receiving messages from leaders across Africa and beyond. Quiet messages, sent through trusted intermediaries, asking how we did it. What was the formula? What was the secret? And I told them all the same thing. There is no secret. There is only will. The will to accept that the first years will be hard. The will to withstand pressure from external enemies and internal doubters. The will to believe that your people can build what they need without permission from those who have been stealing from them. The will to remember that poverty isn't the absence of money, it's the absence of power. And power isn't given, it's taken back. Some listened, some didn't. Some tried and failed because they weren't willing to go far enough to break completely with the old system. They wanted sovereignty with one hand while still holding on to the benefits of integration with the other. But you can't be half sovereign. You can't be partially free. The system is designed to pull you back in through any opening you leave. It's designed to make the cost of resistance seem higher than the cost of compliance. It's designed to isolate rebels and reward collaborators. Breaking it requires complete commitment, not because of ideology, but because of how the system itself functions. Anything less than full break results in full capture, just on a delayed timeline. The regional intelligence that Aminata had brought us continued to yield discoveries. We found evidence of ongoing operations in at least 7 other African nations. Detailed plans for election interference, economic sabotage, targeted character assassination of nationalist leaders. But we also found something else. We found evidence of resistance, of officials who had refused to cooperate, of civil servants who had quietly undermined directives from compromised superiors, of military officers who had slow-rolled implementation of foreign demands. The empire's network had been extensive, but it had never been complete. There had always been antibodies in the system, people who knew something was wrong even if they couldn't articulate exactly what. Our exposure of ECOWAS gave them permission to act on their instincts. It gave them cover. It showed them they weren't alone. A retired Nigerian general contacted us. He had been forced into early retirement after questioning AFRICOM's expanding role in West African military planning. He brought with him classified minutes from meetings where American advisors had essentially dictated strategic priorities, determining where Nigerian forces would deploy, which threats they would prioritize, which groups they would engage. The Nigerian military, one of the largest and most capable in Africa, had been operating under foreign command without most of its own government even realizing it. The general was bitter, but also hopeful. He said, "You've torn away the veil. Now we can see what we're fighting. That's half the battle." We compiled everything into what we called the Lumumba Files, named after Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese leader assassinated with CIA assistance in 1961. The files documented 70 years of interference, from the obvious coups to the subtle manipulation of trade policies, from the assassination of visionary leaders to the promotion of corrupt puppets, from the theft of resources to the distortion of education systems. We released them in stages, carefully curated to maximize impact and minimize the ability of Western media to bury or distort the story. Each release was coordinated with press conferences, with supporting documentation, with testimony from victims and participants. The files went viral in ways that transcended social media algorithms. People printed them, bound them, passed them hand to hand in markets and mosques and churches and universities. Teachers incorporated them into lessons. Artists created works based on them. Musicians wrote songs about them. They became not just evidence, but culture. Not just information, but identity. The story of what had been done to us, yes, but also the story of how we had discovered it, resisted it, overcome it. A story of agency, not just victimhood. A story that ended not in despair, but in determination. The Western response evolved through predictable stages. First, denial. These documents are fabricated. Russian disinformation, Chinese propaganda. Then, dismissal. Even if some of this happened, it was during the Cold War. Things are different now. Then, justification. These interventions prevented worse outcomes, maintained stability, supported democracy. And finally, when none of that worked, distraction. Look at China's influence in Africa. Look at Russia's mercenaries. Look at terrorism, corruption, authoritarianism. Look anywhere except at what we did, what we're still doing, what we'll keep doing unless you stop us. But we didn't look away. We kept our eyes fixed on the target, kept releasing files, kept building alternatives, kept demonstrating that another path was possible. And slowly, the narrative shifted. Not in Western capitals or their media, they would never admit what they had done. But among the people, across the global South, in the conversations that happen away from cameras and microphones, the truth took root. People began to understand that their poverty wasn't natural, wasn't inevitable, wasn't the result of their own inadequacy. It was engineered, maintained, defended by force when necessary. This understanding changed everything. Because once people know they've been robbed, they stop blaming themselves for being poor. Once they know the game is rigged, they stop trying to win by the existing rules. Once they understand that the institutions claiming to help them are actually designed to exploit them, they start building their own institutions. And that's exactly what began happening across Africa. Not coordinated by any central authority, not following any master plan, but organically, inevitably, like water finding new channels when the old ones are blocked. Community banks formed, pooling resources without dependence on IMF-approved financial institutions. Barter networks expanded, allowing trade without dollars or euros or any currency controlled by those who had weaponized currency against us. Educational cooperatives emerged, teaching skills that were actually useful in African contexts rather than preparing students for jobs that didn't exist or required emigration. Agricultural collectives shared seeds, techniques, and equipment without intellectual property restrictions or patent fees. These were small acts, local acts, but multiplied across millions of people, they became revolutionary. The Sahel Sovereignty Bloc formalized what was already happening informally. We created mechanisms for coordination without creating new bureaucracies that could be infiltrated. We established protocols for mutual defense without standing armies that could stage coups. We designed economic frameworks that encouraged cooperation without coerced integration. Everything was built with the lessons of ECOWAS in mind: transparency instead of secrecy, simplicity instead of complexity, flexibility instead of rigid hierarchy. Because we had learned that complexity is where corruption hides, secrecy is where betrayal breeds, and hierarchy is where foreign hands find their puppets. Other regions watched and learned. East African nations began similar conversations. Southern African leaders quietly reached out. Even North African countries, traditionally more connected to Mediterranean and Middle Eastern networks, started asking whether they too had been captured by systems they thought they controlled. The questions spread like cracks in a dam, and the empire, vast and powerful as it was, couldn't be everywhere at once. Couldn't plug every leak, couldn't suppress every rebellion, couldn't co-opt every alternative. For the first time in centuries, they were playing defense instead of offense. I won't pretend it was easy, or that everyone supported what we were doing. There were legitimate criticisms alongside the propaganda. We made mistakes, of course we did. We moved too fast in some areas, too slow in others. We trusted some people we shouldn't have and doubted some we should have believed. We implemented policies that sounded good but created unintended problems. We were building a new system while dismantling an old one, governing a country while fighting a covert war, maintaining basic services while restructuring the entire economy. There were shortages. There were disruptions. There were moments when people questioned whether the cost of sovereignty was worth it. But here's what kept us going: the alternative. We had watched previous generations try to reform the system from within, try to negotiate better terms, try to achieve development through approved channels. And we had seen where that led: to debt that could never be repaid, to resources extracted and never returned, to leaders who started with good intentions but ended as administrators of their own people's exploitation, to sovereignty in name only, flag and anthem and UN seat, but no actual power over anything that mattered. That was the alternative. And once you truly understood that, once you felt it in your bones, the hardships of genuine independence became bearable. More than bearable, they became purposeful. There was a moment, about 18 months after we withdrew from ECOWAS, when the pressure reached its peak. The sanctions were biting harder than we had anticipated. A drought had damaged the harvest. Fuel prices had spiked because our traditional suppliers were under Western pressure to cut us off. There were protests in Ouagadougou, people demanding that we negotiate, that we compromise, that we find a way back to the table. I could have given a speech explaining why that was impossible, why any compromise would eventually lead back to the same trap. But instead, I did something different. I invited a group of the protesters to meet with me, not their leaders or spokespeople, but a random selection, 23 people, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers and students. We sat in a circle, no podium, no cameras, just conversation. And I asked them to tell me about their lives, not about politics or economics, but about their actual daily existence. What they ate, where they worked, what they hoped for their children. And as they spoke, patterns emerged. Every single one of them, even the angriest, even the most desperate, described a life that was harder than their parents' lives had been, despite decades of development aid, despite ECOWAS, despite all the programs and initiatives and partnerships with the West. Then I asked them a simple question: why? If we had been doing everything the approved way, following all the advice, implementing all the recommended reforms, opening our markets, privatizing our industries, liberalizing our economy, why were things getting worse instead of better? The room fell silent, because they had never asked themselves that question. They had accepted the narrative that poverty was their fault, their government's incompetence, their culture's backwardness, their continent's curse. They had never considered that the system itself might be the problem, that help might actually be harm, that the medicine might be poison. One woman, a market seller in her 50s, spoke up. She said, My mother sold vegetables in this same market. She owned her stall. She made enough to send me to school, to save money, to help her relatives. I sell vegetables in the same market, but now I rent the stall from a company in Abidjan. The seeds I plant come from a company in France and I have to buy new ones every year. The fertilizer comes from a company in America and costs more every season. I work harder than my mother ever did and I'm poorer than she ever was. I thought it was my fault. But maybe it's not. That was the turning point, not in policy, but in consciousness, because once that woman articulated what she had experienced, others recognized it in their own lives. The mechanic who now had to use expensive imported parts instead of fixing and reusing what broke. The teacher who had to follow a curriculum designed in Paris instead of teaching what his students actually needed to know. The farmer who had been convinced to switch from diverse crops to cotton monoculture and now couldn't feed his own family. Each of them had a piece of the puzzle. And when they put the pieces together, they saw the picture. They saw the system. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The protests didn't stop. But they changed character. Instead of demanding that we go back, people started asking how they could help move forward. The market woman organized other vendors to pool resources and buy a stall collectively. The mechanic started a workshop teaching people to repair equipment with locally available materials. The teacher created supplemental lessons in Morée and Dioula that connected formal education to practical skills. These weren't things I ordered or even suggested. They were things people chose to do because they understood the logic of sovereignty in their own lives, because they realized that independence wasn't something the government did for them, it was something they did themselves, in a million small ways, every single day. This was the real revolution, not the dramatic exposure of CIA networks or the withdrawal from ECOWAS or the satellite launch. Those were symbols, important symbols, but symbols nonetheless. The real revolution was this: people reclaiming their agency, their creativity, their power to shape their own existence. People realizing that they didn't need permission from experts or approval from international institutions or validation from Western media. They just needed to start building what they needed, using what they had, where they were. And once that started, it was unstoppable. Not because we were stronger than the empire. We weren't. Not because we had more resources. We didn't. But because we had something they couldn't destroy with sanctions or subvert with propaganda or kill with drones, we had legitimacy. We had the support of people who had tried everything else and were ready to try something new. We had the credibility that comes from being willing to sacrifice for what you claim to believe. We had the moral authority that comes from being right, not in some abstract philosophical sense, but in the concrete sense of accurately describing reality and offering solutions that actually worked. The Kaya Accords evolved into something more comprehensive than we had initially envisioned. What started as a defensive alliance between three nations became a template for restructuring international relations. We drafted principles that other nations could adopt without joining any formal organization, without subordinating themselves to any new authority. Principles like resource sovereignty, debt repudiation for illegitimate loans, rejection of structural adjustment programs, prioritization of food security over cash crops, protection of indigenous knowledge from intellectual property regimes, right to development on locally determined terms. These weren't revolutionary ideas, they were basic common sense. But they had been revolutionary in practice because the entire global system was designed to prevent them. Countries across the global south began adopting versions of these principles, not uniformly, not completely, but enough to create meaningful change. Ecuador rewrote its constitution to recognize the rights of nature. Bolivia expelled USAID and ended cooperation with DEA. Venezuela withstood sanctions that would have broken most nations. Cuba continued its quiet resistance, now less alone. Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador elected governments that challenged American hegemony. Even within countries that remained nominally aligned with the West, movements emerged demanding genuine sovereignty. The dam was breaking, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably. The empire's response revealed its limitations. They could sanction some countries, but not all. They could stage coups in some places, but not everywhere simultaneously. They could dominate media narratives in their own sphere, but couldn't prevent information from flowing through alternative channels. They could bribe some leaders, but couldn't buy everyone. Their power was vast, but not infinite. Their reach was long, but not limitless. And every time they acted overtly, Every time they dropped the mask of benevolent partnership and revealed the iron fist, they created more enemies, more skeptics, more people willing to risk resistance. I received a letter from a young woman in Ghana. She was a software engineer, educated at Oxford, working for a British tech company. She wrote, "I spent my whole life trying to become acceptable to the West. I changed my accent, straightened my hair, laughed at their jokes, agreed with their assumptions. I thought if I was good enough, smart enough, civilized enough, they would see me as equal, but they never did. I was always the diversity hire, the African exception, the token proving their system worked. Your exposure of ECOWAS showed me what I should have known all along. They don't want us as equals. They want us as resources. I'm coming home. I'm bringing my skills home. Not to work for their company's African branches, but to build our own technology, our own platforms, our own future." That letter represented thousands of similar stories. The brain drain that had sapped Africa's potential for decades began to reverse. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to matter. Young people who had left seeking opportunity started coming back seeking purpose. Professionals who had succeeded in the West started questioning what success meant. Academics who had published in prestigious journals started asking who those journals served. Artists who had gained international recognition started wondering who controlled the platforms that gave recognition. And many of them concluded that the price of participation in Western-dominated systems was too high, that they were being used to legitimize their own people's exploitation. That coming home wasn't failure but liberation. This created a virtuous cycle. As more talented people returned, the quality of local institutions improved. As local institutions improved, they could offer more to talented people. As they offered more people came home. The cycle had been vicious for so long, pulling Africa's best and brightest away, leaving institutions weak, making it harder to retain anyone capable of strengthening them. Breaking that cycle required the initial shock, the exposure of ECOWAS, the demonstration that something different was possible. But once broken, the cycle could run in reverse, could become reinforcing rather than depleting, could build rather than drain. We established what we called the Sankara Fellowship, named after Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, who had been assassinated with French complicity in 1987. The fellowship offered positions to African professionals willing to return home and dedicate at least 5 years to building sovereign institutions. The salary wasn't competitive with what they could earn in the West. The conditions weren't comfortable, but they came anyway. Engineers who designed renewable energy systems adapted to Sahel conditions. Doctors who developed healthcare models that didn't depend on pharmaceutical imports. Economists who created alternative metrics for measuring prosperity. Teachers who reimagined education starting from African languages and epistemologies rather than treating them as obstacles to overcome. These fellows became the infrastructure of the new system, not physical infrastructure, though that was important, but intellectual and institutional infrastructure. The knowledge base, the networks, the practices, the norms that allow a society to function on its own terms rather than as an appendage to someone else's system. This couldn't be imported or donated or developed by foreign experts. It could only be built by people who understood the context deeply because they lived it, who were committed to the project because it was their project, who would persist through difficulties because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to believe in. The attacks continued, of course. They never stopped. But they became less effective as we became more resilient. When they assassinated one of our ministers, we had others ready to step into the role. When they sabotaged infrastructure, we had alternatives. When they spread propaganda, we had our own media. When they imposed sanctions, we had other partners. We had learned what every successful resistance movement eventually learns, that survival requires redundancy, adaptability, decentralization, that you can't defend everything, but you can ensure that nothing is irreplaceable, that the strength of a network isn't in its strongest node, but in its ability to function when nodes fail. 5 years after the ECOWAS exposure, we held an anniversary gathering in Ouagadougou, not a celebration, because the struggle was far from over, but a reflection. Representatives came from 47 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, people who had followed our example, who had implemented their own versions of sovereignty, who had paid their own costs and achieved their own victories. We shared lessons learned, strategies that worked, mistakes to avoid, that the empire could be challenged, that another world wasn't just theoretically possible but actually being built in fragments and pieces across the global south. I spoke briefly at that gathering, I said, 5 years ago we exposed a network of control that had operated in shadow for decades, but exposure wasn't enough. Many things have been exposed without changing. What made the difference was what came after exposure, the building, the hard, unglamorous, frustrating work of creating alternatives, of proving that we could feed ourselves, educate ourselves, defend ourselves, govern ourselves without permission or assistance from those who had claimed to be indispensable. That work continues. It will continue for generations, because systems that took centuries to build will take decades to dismantle. But make no mistake, they are being dismantled. Not by any one leader or nation, but by millions of people making millions of small decisions that add up to one large transformation. The decision to plant food instead of cash crops, to teach in mother tongues instead of colonial languages, to trade with neighbors instead of distant masters, to trust our own judgment instead of deferring to foreign experts. These decisions, multiplied across communities and countries, are rewriting the story of our continent and our world. The applause was long but subdued, because everyone in that room understood what the words meant in practice. They had all paid costs, they had all faced opposition, they had all wondered if it was worth it. But they had all concluded that it was, not because the path was easy, but because every other path led back to the same place. Subjugation dressed up as partnership, exploitation disguised as development, control masked as cooperation. They had chosen the harder path because it was the only path that led to freedom. And freedom, they had learned, wasn't a destination you reached, but a practice you maintained, a vigilance you sustained, a refusal you renewed every single day. Legacy is not what you leave, I had said. It's what you unlock. And that's what the ECOWAS exposure ultimately did. It unlocked something that had been sealed by fear, by propaganda, by the sheer weight of centuries of domination. It unlocked the possibility of thinking differently, of organizing differently, of existing differently in the world. It showed that the emperor had no clothes, that the system was vulnerable, that resistance was possible. But more than that, it showed that resistance wasn't just possible but already happening, not in some distant future, but right now, in ways small and large, visible and invisible, celebrated and unnoticed. The CIA's network didn't die with the ECOWAS exposure. Networks like that adapt. They found new channels, new covers, new methods, but they were forced to operate differently, more carefully, with less confidence. They had to assume they were being watched, that their assets might be exposed. They had to work harder for the same results. And that alone was a victory. The goal wasn't to destroy them. That was impossible. The goal was to make their operations more difficult, more expensive, more visible, less effective. To raise the cost of empire until it exceeded the benefits. We were achieving it through thousands of small acts of resistance, each one making the machinery of domination a little less smooth, a little more vulnerable to breakdown. This is about a continent that remembered it had a spine, about mothers who refused poisoned aid, about soldiers who said no to UN chains, about farmers who saved seeds, about teachers who taught truth, about young people who came home, about a market woman who realized her poverty wasn't her fault, about all of us who decided we would rather struggle for our own future than prosper as instruments of someone else's present.